Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
Sort of speaks to the breadth of the issues that we're going to talk about today. We're going to start out by asking panel members to introduce yourselves. Then we're going to ask the presenters to introduce yourselves. Danielle is going to do a brief summary, and then we'll get right to the questions. There will be time later this morning for some questions from the audience. So if you are in the audience and want to speak, we'll have a person with a microphone who can help you with that. And then we'll finish with some opportunity for questions from the board. All right. I'm Chris Harder. I'm the Quality Assurance Manager here at Scott County.
I'm Cindy Geist. I'm the Community Services Director for Scott County.
Jake Grusing, Library Director for Scott County.
Lisa Brodsky, Public Health Director for Scott County.
Linda Janowski, Scott County CDA.
Dan Lauer-Schumacher, I'm a housing coordinator here at Scott County.
Abby Guilford, I am the Continuum of Care Coordinator for the suburban metro area.
Brian Tucker, the Planning Manager for City of Savage.
Mike Waldo, Live, Learn, Earn Housing Work Group Chair, and also work for Ron Clark Construction. We do both affordable and for sale housing.
And I'm Danielle Fox. Good morning, Adult Social Services Manager for Scott County. I'll kick us off here. Thank you for having us here this morning, and thanks to everybody that showed up. It's either a really good thing or a really bad thing when you fill a boardroom, so I guess we'll see how this goes. So we hope to cover the extraordinarily large topic of housing today, and we have two big buckets that we're looking to focus on. So we would like to do a fairly high-level overview of life cycle housing in general, and then we have some specific data sets around homelessness, since Scott County as a lead agency has a role in overseeing that work. As one of the fastest growing counties across the state, Scott County has seen an enormous amount of growth in the need for housing, and not for any one particular type of housing. We see a full spectrum of need, from emergency housing of people who are seeking shelter for homelessness, all the way to a need for additional executive housing. So we hope to be able to cover a broad brush of that. And I think one of the primary questions that we get asked as Scott County staff sometimes is, what is the role of government in housing, and specifically what is the role of county government in that work? I think we have moved forward on a number of things that are appropriate for county work to start, and I think we're sort of trying to determine what is our role moving forward. Right now we are, obviously with this presentation, doing some work around articulating the need, collecting data. We are sort of in a good position to get a good collective view of the county in general. We also have been in a good place and have hosted many conversations around the topic, whether that be supporting work for our homeless groups and our housing coalition meetings, having conversations like this, participating in our Live, Learn, Earn groups that have been going on for the last several years. There is a specific pillar related to housing, and so we have had a number of partners who have shown up on a regular basis to discuss these topics. We have since split up into two work groups where we are working, one with our municipal partners who are looking to identify ways that we can build additional supply in the community, and then we have a group that's focusing on our community members and engaging and trying to inform our citizens about various topics. We certainly have a role as a county in our Scott County comp planning, but recognize that there's a lot of roles that other partners play. So even though we've got a number of panelists here today and a room full of people who participate in the topic, we felt like we couldn't get all those partners even in this one room because it's such a big area to cover. So beyond that, I think we are focused on providing services to our vulnerable citizens in Health and Human Services, but really it will depend on what makes sense for the Scott County community moving forward. But I will kick it off to our panelists to do just a brief introduction of themselves again and their role. But you have two documents. You have the Scott County Delivers packet that the board received prior, and many of you have seen. We also did provide in the audience a job profile, which provides some of essentially the cliff notes of the status of the county. So if there's anything else the panel would like to say before we get started quickly, otherwise
Would
kick
you
it
mind
off to
if
you.
Would you mind if we start?
Sure, go for it.
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Did we want them to say anything more about their jobs? No?
I think
Okay.
it'll,
Okay,
yeah.
it'll come out.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the information. It was very broad, and it seemed to hit a lot of different people, and as we're looking at the vulnerable, the disabled, the senior, their needs are so dramatically different, and how to weigh those needs and try to move the trajectory forward without getting buried has got to be really difficult. So just understanding the topic, I just want to thank you for the information. It was great. And one of the things that I would like to talk to first on was the page 7. I was a little bit confused on, it's the ones that are referred. And it seems that these referrals seem to be mainly, I mean, it's across all the spectrums, or is it specific to a specific area, seniors or the disabled or the homeless? I'm not entirely certain. And the other thing that I noticed on here is even though the trajectory and the outcome is advancing, which is great, what are the biggest barriers in moving this upward in a little bit larger fashion? And where do we line up against other counties? Are they having the same issues, or is their percentage turnout still pretty low?
Sure, well, I'll start us off and then I'll kick it over to Dan and Abby because I think they have some great insight into this. But these numbers on page 7 relate directly to people who are assessed for homelessness and they're homeless enough to make it onto this wait list. And these are people who were referred to a program, so not necessarily that they found a positive outcome, but these are the folks that were referred, or these were inside. You can speak much better to this, Dan.
Yeah, so if you look at the little chart that's underneath, so there was right around, I think it was 51 in 2017 and like 53 openings like for people to receive like a subsidy or some short-term help. And so it took us 78 and then in 2018, 82 households to fill those slots. So when we're reaching out to those households, they're all experiencing homelessness. And some of them were unable to reach. Some of them may have been referred to a program, but they don't meet the specific qualifications. And then the third group is those who were enrolled in the program, but they weren't able to find a unit that was willing to accept either the voucher or the short-term help. They weren't able to locate the unit. So those are the number of households in the very bottom who at least were referred to a program. The number above that, households that those are the households that in those years actually moved into a housing unit. And then the number above that is the ultimate goal of where we would say homelessness has been ended, is that if someone becomes homeless and then they're connected with a resource, and sometimes that's a unit, sometimes that's a voucher, sometimes that's short-term help, within 90 days. Because to say that no one's ever going to be evicted or lose their housing is unrealistic, but within a very short period of time, they've got the resources to get back into housing. So that's kind of what those three numbers are. And so the barriers tend to be if people have poor rental history, and that may be because of symptoms relating to mental health. They may have other barriers where they need like a handicap accessible unit, things like that. And then other things like criminal background, limited income, or gaps in employment, so that they're struggling to be able to afford the housing that's out there.
Just one follow-up question, if I may. So this is for the homeless, and I just wanted to call it out just because, for the audience more so than anybody. What happens with those folks that don't fall within this bucket? So do the seniors and the disabled, do they go through the same level of assessment when their files brought to the county for review? Or do they have another whole different process that you go through when analyzing the needs of those other buckets of folks that are looking for some level of guidance?
So we really do have limited resources for folks who don't fall into one of those qualifying buckets. And unfortunately, what you'll see is this information, I feel like, is directly tied to page 18 when you're looking at our vacancy rates across the county. So a lot of those populations are looking for available rental units. Our vacancy rate is about 0.9%. And so when you have someone who has barriers, as Dan's talking about, of poor rental history, or if it's a senior who needs, say, a first floor unit, they, I think, have these additional barriers that just stack onto that the general public is also seeing. And so it makes it much more difficult for them to identify a place, even when, as Dan said, we have vouchers that are available, typically from state or federal funding, that we could pay their rent on an ongoing basis. We just can't find the spot to put them in.
I have a question. So Danielle used the phrase like homelessness enough or homeless enough. We have people who aren't homeless enough. Can anybody on the panel put a little, elaborate on that a little bit and give us a sense of what that means? That's the first part of the question. And the second part is who, if anybody, serves those people if they don't qualify for a mandated or a public program that we operate as county government. What services are available to them?
So homeless enough is not a nice term, but we use it unfortunately because as Danielle said, we have really limited resources in terms of what's available to serve homeless households. We have far more homeless households than we have resources. And so in my role as the COC coordinator, HUD, the Federal Housing Development Agency, has really pushed us to prioritize the households that are most in need. And HUD has a very specific definition of what is homeless enough for their programs, and that is literally, you are literally homeless, so you are accessing a shelter. You are living in a place not meant for human habitation. Those are the two big kind of buckets that you have to be eligible for HUD programs. On the state side, there are lots of state programs that fund homeless resources, and that we have a little bit broader definition in Minnesota. So you can be couch hopping or doubled up to meet some of those definitions. And so we use those definitions as homeless enough for the programs that were that are on page 7 that we're filling these vacancies with. For folks who don't qualify, unfortunately right now as a continuum, we don't have a lot of good solutions for those households. There are some prevention resources that are more county specific through the state funding of the FHPAP funds, but again, it's fairly limited. We have a lot more need than we have resource right now.
And Abby's referring to the family homelessness prevention and support, right? So those dollars can be accessed through the CAP agency for prevention. But when we review data around the percent of people who call into contact looking for support and those who actually receive support, it's fairly limited. Yeah. It's a very low percentage of people who call that we're actually able to meet their needs. So there is a pretty significant gap there.
Abby, with your perspective, kind of as a regional partner, do you have anything you would offer to Cindy's question about some kind of comparative between counties and like how is the state of things in Scott County compared to maybe the other suburban counties?
Sure. So I would say overall, we have just started looking at, this is waitlist data, we've referred to it as the priority list, they're kind of interchangeable. But overall, the priority list moves pretty similarly across the entire region. But I think each county the suburban metro area includes Anoka, Washington, Scott Carver, and Dakota counties. So that's kind of our geography that we cover. I can't necessarily speak to Hennepin and Ramsey. They're on their own islands a lot of the time. But the wait list moves, for the most part, pretty consistently across the region. These trends that you see on your slide are pretty consistent. But I do think counties across the region have different system gaps. So when we think about this continuum of housing resources that we're responsible for. It's everything from prevention all the way through emergency shelter and then on up to permanent supportive housing. And I think in looking where Scott County has probably the biggest gap is in some of that emergency shelter. We don't have enough across the region as a whole, but I think if you're looking on the continuum, that's probably where Scott County's biggest gap is with that emergency placement. So we identify somebody as homeless, where can they go tonight so they're not still sleeping in their car? Not that other communities have that figured out, but they have more resources than what you do here.
So on page 11, there's a little component here that says homelessness, in the lower left there. Homelessness trend lines are going down, but Scott and Carver, it seems to be going up. And is it because we're maybe a little bit more rural? What is the reason that the trend lines here or our numbers are going up? And have we put any thought into, are there strategies that other counties are doing? I mean, it probably has some cost to it, but if it's substantial enough to change that trajectory, is it worth the conversation?
I would say that it's not just Scott and Carver counties that we're seeing this trend, but across our whole continuum of care. So the whole
Metro
5
area.
counties that
Okay.
we see. And really, we've seen a significant uptick in unsheltered homelessness in the past few years, which is a significant concern. And I think we're having ongoing conversations as a region about what shelter solutions look like for that. But funding is a real challenge with that, and in a model that works well for a wide array of need is another significant challenge with that conversation.
We've had, I think, a lot of those discussions within the Live, Learn, Earn group about homelessness as a symptom, but it's a symptom of lack of housing overall, right? So if people can't find available units, then they're more prone to go into homelessness, as well as sort of that mismatch of median wages, which you'll see also on page 10 and 11, where it compares our average wages versus the average cost of available units here.
I have a question. On page 9, you mentioned that those fleeing domestic violence has been the largest increase in 2018. And I have several questions about that. I'm wondering, is this a trend across the metro, or is this something specific to Scott County? And if you know, what percentage of the homeless in 2018 were those with DD situations?
I think we've certainly seen that trend locally. I think that when we've talked with our metro partners, it has also been an issue metro-wide. Again, though, as Abby referred to, there is sort of a gap in having those emergency shelter options. So we don't have a specific percentage that I'm aware of. What we do for our wait list is try to categorize people based on risk, and that could be part of that. But actually, for people who are fleeing domestic violence, we do not have any emergency shelter options for them right now in Scott County.
But they are still given priority?
So it's weighted based on a number of risk factors, so they're not necessarily over other risk priorities. And again, they have to be homeless enough to meet that criteria, and as Abby said, some of that criteria for federal voucher programs is that they have to be homeless, literally homeless. So part of that meeting that qualification could be staying in emergency shelter, which we don't have. So what ends up happening is people might, we've heard from our domestic violence partners in the community is that they may end up staying in their current situation. They might try to go couch hopping and stay with family or friends, but it is a gap.
Has there been, I mean, I don't know what the numbers that we're talking about, but is there any consideration, or has there been any discussion about putting a DV shelter in Scott County?
I think that's certainly been one of the issues that's brought up. There have been, I think, recommendations and requests from many of our community members to have emergency shelter for domestic violence, for mental health, for seniors, we just have such a gap in all of those services. So I don't know that there's been any one targeted request to develop a shelter. There is a local group that is meeting on a regular basis to talk about shelter options, but it has been in the broad sense and not one specific population.
Danielle, you started to talk a little bit about the data related to housing stock. And I wonder, and you mentioned that Mike was doing some work on like building the supply, I think is how you said it. Is that right? Through Live and Earn. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about just some of the slides, like starting on page 9 and then also looking at page 11. Can you talk about some of those gaps in what the strategies might be around building that?
Sure. So we talked about the Live, Learn, Earn group that has been meeting, that Scott County has been participating in, had talked a lot about housing, and we spent a lot of time identifying data, which we have quite a bit of, and so this is really the high level and basic information. But that group felt like it was appropriate to split into 2 subgroups. So one is our community stakeholders group, and the other one is our municipal partners. So that would be, I think, work that Mike has chaired within the Live, Learn, Earn group, would certainly include Brian and some of his coworkers in the cities. And if you guys want to talk a little bit about what you're working on.
I think that, part of it, as you've seen here, is that the problem is huge and multifaceted. I think at every level of housing today, whether you're trying to find housing at literally 100,000 or 700,000, the costs in the last 6 years have gone up, let's say 40%. I don't think that's unusual. If I look, we built our first apartment village in Savage, Village Commons, compared to what we just finished in Pike Lake, and we were seeing probably a third higher cost. And so what has wages gone up during that same time frame? Not even close to that. So I think that gap keeps getting wider. New homes versus used. The people that were coming out of their used homes aren't moving into a new home because they're 50% more cost. We're the largest spread right now between new home construction and existing market for the same type of home. So all those things just keep exacerbating the problem at every level that we're seeing. The information, as we've tried to put it, is we're trying to pick apart the small things. We're trying to pick apart, getting additional workforce housing, which I think Scott County, since we first did it in 2011, that was one of the first projects of workforce housing that had been done in 10 years, 15 years probably. And now, last 2 years, we've got 200 some units brought in. Yep. And that again is the person making 60% AMI, which is family of 4 is 56,000, I think. Whereas a lot of the stuff in the homelessness, that's where you're looking at people making 30% AMI, which I'm not sure exactly that number, but let's say under 20,000 a household. Yeah. So I think those are kind of the issues we're running into. I think the solutions are, as you say, we pick apart the things where you're seeing Shakopee now bringing in some multifamily, bigger projects, which then, even though they're a little bit higher end, they draw to a more diverse crowd. You can get efficiency apartment and be under $1,000. You've got places to move. I think the senior population, again, if we turn to the other spectrum, is the senior group, albeit they want to have an option, many of them aren't ready to move to a multifamily situation. I think that's probably the hardest thing that we're seeing is people are living longer, which is great, but that used to be where all the young families picked up the houses at the lower end of the spectrum. They could be a 40, 50, 60% AMI person and buy a single family because there was available stock as people attritioned out. Now we're seeing less senior homes, less senior stuff being built because the greatest generation, they don't want to leave their houses. And I think that's something that socially, engineering-wise, we'd love to see that happen, but they're not ready to make that move. I think as we evolve into, the people that are our age, 50, 60, in the next 10 years, I think we're going to look for more of a simplistic approach to our life, and I think the multifamily senior housing will expand and start to replenish some of that supply. But those are all things that are just moving down that path.
Yeah, and I think, some of our cities are done with their comprehensive plan. Savage is still working on getting ours approved, but, we can designate land for high-density housing, and it's on the map, and it meets the Met Council requirements in terms of having enough property available for those type of uses. But as Mike's suggesting, the market just isn't there for that to happen without subsidies or city assistance because of land costs and construction costs and things like that. So we've had a couple of workforce housing projects we've been able to get approved in Savage. One of them involved a Met Council grant and housing tax credits. Another property that's under construction now was a property the city owned, so we were able to sell the property to the developer at a reasonable cost and help with a loan to make that, project viable. And then they were able to get tax credits for that project as well. But they're hard to finance. They're hard to get approved because, unfortunately, folks live in a neighborhood and then they see a project like this and they jump to a lot of conclusions about who's going to live there and what's going to be the impact on the school and my property values and things like that. So even if you have a good project, a viable property, they can still be difficult projects to get approved just because, there's concerns from the neighborhood. Some may be, valid, others are just really assumptions or presumptions that are incorrect. But the short of it is, the cities can designate properties for these types of uses, but it really, it's that additional step of working with developers to make a project that's gonna work from a financial standpoint because they're difficult.
But it is a huge first step for the cities to start to get more property zoned at the higher levels, because it's one less fight for the NIMBYs when you are taking a project in and it's already zoned properly. Now you're just working through the smaller pieces. You're not having to really rezone it, or change a comp plan, which adds just a lot more information to it. And I think one of the things that, again, one of the reasons we split up the housing group is to focus on education and to focus on outreach. Because you don't want to have to just outreach when we have a project, because at that point we're too late. And I think that's where Beacon Interfaith and some of the people like that have done great work over multiple periods of time to do a project. It may take 2 years to get a project in place, but they educate the people through that and through the faith community, which is an area where they've done a great job of expanding that. And people start to see, well, just because they make $50,000 a year versus somebody making 75, they're just like us. They get up in the morning and go to work, and that's what 95% of the people do. So I think that's what people have to understand.
And you'll see some of those barriers play out on page 14 and 15 when it talks about the new units that are permitted in Scott County and how that's seen a pretty rapid decrease since the early 2000s. And then if you look on page 15, that outlines how many of those new units that were added are affordable, meaning that they're within 30% of the average income. So sometimes what we hear from some of our seniors, for example, is that there are senior housing options available, but they're so expensive that it's just way outside of their price range.
And another piece, townhomes is the other thing that's probably the least, that's what went away a lot after the 2006, 2007, 2008 crash is, and they have not come back. And a lot of that is cost, but a lot of it actually is regulation. And it's the fact that you have to sprinkle everyone, even though from a fire standpoint, the barriers between the units are probably more stronger than anything you have in your own home. And so, but now to add another $7,000 a unit to add sprinkler systems and the various things, the regulations have pushed the townhome piece to another level that isn't there. Plus, you get sued. I mean, if you're gonna build a townhome, it's not if you're gonna get sued, it's just one. At the end of somewhere between 7, 8, 9, 10 years, the association's gonna sue you and say, every single thing you did was wrong. And whether they've maintained it. So there's new laws that have come out, but they have about this much teeth. And there's attorneys with big buildings who have paid for their entire buildings just suing builders on association maintaining stuff, so.
So it's just such a disincentive for anyone to get involved in that work.
Yes.
While we're on page 14, why does this matter? The second sentence there refers to using this data to evaluate if, as a county, we're keeping up with demand. Is that, I'm assuming that's projected demand, or is that just in response to demand from the market in real time?
Well, I think either. I think we can see, based on the fact that we have seen a substantial amount of growth in the population of Scott County from 2000 to 2017, but we haven't seen that availability of housing options. So we certainly have seen that in the data. We've seen that from our citizens that we've spoken to. We've seen that from people who end up within Health and Human Services, who are experiencing homelessness, who come to our door with that.
So how are we doing? I didn't see anything, I may have missed it in here. How are we doing, keeping up with demand across all housing types? Are there areas of great success, or what's the story with keeping up?
I don't have the Maxfield study information, and that's the one probably, if you look at that, it's on the CDA website. That's got a lot of the information. And again, we're in the process right now as a group of, those are done every 5 years, and we're trying to get an incremental point to say, okay, from when that data was obtained in late 2016, how have we done? I would say, as weird as it is, I think on some of the workforce housing, we've probably done better than we probably have at some of the mid and lower range of the for sale product. And that's what we're expecting to see, but we want to get some concrete information on permits from each of the cities and determine where that's going at the county level, but we don't have that information today.
And some of that need being met can be seen on page 18 and 19, because when you look at the vacancy rates, that would reflect what's available, right? So in June 2016, our vacancy rate for rentals was 0.9%. So in 2017, we had an overall vacancy of 4.1%, which is close to that healthy range of 5%. But then when you get into rentals and it's 0.9% or less in many communities, it's really hard for folks who aren't looking to purchase a home to rent anything, and the homes available for purchase have been well outside of the affordable range for many folks.
And anything below about a 1 to 1.2 vacancy is zero, because that's literally just the turns of people leaving the community to get you to that number. That means that there is zero vacancy. I mean, you're literally, somebody moves out on the 20th and you're back in on the 31st. I mean, it's that quick. And maybe you have 1 month a year where you take some months to fill it. That's really what amounts to it.
I have a question, and not specific to any one of these, but when we look at the cost to provide housing to all these different pillars of folks, and knowing that there are some gaps, and when you look at the need versus the availability, have you streamlined, or have you did an analysis on what services, what costs do we incur because of the lack of housing? So we don't have the housing, so therefore, we're going to provide emergency shelter, we're going to provide some level of assistance in other venues. Maybe there's an impact in our jails, there's an impact in our courts. Have we looked at what are the costs because of the lack of housing? And if we did, yes, it may be expensive, and our upfront cost may be difficult for our citizens to realize, but when we look at the decrease in maybe some of these other costs, where do we balance out? I guess I don't know, because of lack of housing, where are all the other costs that are now incurred because of it?
I think it's incredibly hard to articulate that, but I think that we know from the information that we've looked at that the cost is incredibly significant. And there's an impact, as you mentioned, to our jails. There's an impact what if kids can read by 3rd grade. There's an impact to kindergarten readiness. There's an impact to economic development. It's really hard for us to articulate that based on the information that we have. Because if someone has experienced insecure housing or homelessness at some point in their life, that impacts them for the rest of their life. And then has a system impact from a county standpoint. I think we see it a lot in HHS around people who are either currently experiencing or have in the past. But we'll see it come out in different ways. It might be in adult protection, it might be in child protection, it might be in people looking for waivered services, just a number of different ways. But it is very hard to articulate that cost, yeah. I wish we had that magic.
Yeah.
Can you tell me what the land bank does?
Sure. Community Land Trust is another tool for affordable homeownership. It's actually where an entity such as the CDA would hold the land in trust, and the homeowner would only need to be able to afford the mortgage on the home or the improvement itself. So it's a way for people to build wealth and equity that may not have a chance to do that. We're looking at different models. We're involved right now in the Resilient Communities Program, and we're having some students at the U of M help us do some research and development of that program. Again, it's a really good way to be a steward of the dollars invested in affordable housing, because it's more like a one-time investment up front. It may be a little bit more than, say, a first-time home buyer grant, but it stays with that property and makes it perpetually affordable. So the first homeowner has to qualify income restrictions, and then when they sell, and the statistics say about 80% of those homeowners that are living in a land trust home go into the regular market and buy within that same community. The next homeowner is also income restricted, so it's really a good thing to keep that affordability with that property and allow those homeowners to build that wealth and equity so they can go into the next home.
And that's like, for me, looking at our ability to use the vouchers that we have for households, having something like the land bank would be really, really great, because it moves those top-end renters out of the rental market and into actual home ownership, which then frees up the units, creating more vacancy. And so then it's more likely a landlord's willing to work with our some of our subsidies or vouchers, because if you have a unit open up and you have 10 people, none of which have any voucher or any additional subsidy, all looking at it, it's just a lot easier to do that than to work with the households that we're working with. And so helping those kind of high-end renters move into the home ownership goes a long way to trickling down and then helping us house the households out of homelessness.
Is there one of your agencies that holds any outcome data about like people who have been through that process and what happens long-term? And is there outcome data related to those families?
For the land bank?
Yeah.
Actually, there probably are statewide and nationally, but each land bank kind of does a different way to use their subsidy. Some land banks go after the properties. As I mentioned, they just buy a property or build a property, and they have the land not included in the cost. Other programs go after people that, say, are in foreclosure or in tax forfeiture. So they help those homeowners get right, and then their mortgage is less. I don't know, again, that's data kind of all over the place, so it's, again, a little bit hard to aggregate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So Danielle mentioned this at the beginning. You referred to the question, what is the role of government? And we have government representation on the panel, and we have some non-government representation on the panel. I think it would be interesting to hear where you are in that conversation. I think you hinted at that's the question that sort of hangs over some of this work, especially at the county government level. What is our role in this conversation? But I'd be interested in just hearing everybody's perspective on what is the role of government from where you're sitting in this housing conversation.
You want to start, or you want me to? Which perspective do you want first?
exactly.
No, I think from a realist perspective, I mean, everyone understands the fiscal responsibility that all of us are, whether we're a business owner or a city or a county or anyone else. I think the key really becomes efficient use of resources. And I think that's one of the things we as a housing group, I think, have focused on, is putting together all the resources that are currently there, looking for where there's resources that are or not able. And I think if we look at, some of the tax credit programs that we've worked with quite a bit, and that Brian's had a situation with staff, those are very efficient uses. The amount of federal or state dollars per unit is a lower number than some of the other. Now, if we're going into a homeless situation, there you're looking at a less efficient use, but there's no other options. And I think that's kind of the biggest key, is looking at the various perspectives of income levels from 30% up to even 100% AMI, all of which are needing some level of assistance in today's marketplace and looking at how you be most efficient. And I think that we could have a whole 2.5-hour panel just on those things, but I think that's really the key, is everyone looks at it when the governing bodies are looking at it, is how to be efficient. When we go into a city like Minnetonka, they evaluate how many dollars per unit per year are we contributing or assisting here, because they're going to get it back normally at the end of a 30-year period. Are we putting forward, and how many units do we get for that? So if they can get a project that allows them to contribute $500 per year per unit versus another one that, because you're doing a smaller unit count, is $1,500 per unit, that's much more efficient. And I think that's how we started to look at it. Then that dollar is being more efficient, then it can, as we talk about trickling down, now there's more major government dollars available for the 30% AMI in the homeless group, which there really is no other market rate way to do those.
I would say from the city perspective, there's a couple of approaches. One, you can have the zoning in place, which I think all of our cities do, and then just wait for the market to try to make these things happen. And we've already kind of talked about the fact that that really doesn't happen just because of land costs and other things. So then the next step for a city would be, okay, are we willing to get in and help a developer and support a developer by looking for ways to help them score better on their housing credit applications? Does the city want to waive fees? Do we want to, somehow participate to make that project more viable? And I think that's what's been occurring now more often to get some of these projects underway. And then that next step really is, I think, where a lot of our cities need to have more discussions is, do we want to be more proactive? Do we want to go out as a city and purchase property to earmark for a use like this and then go out and find developers to do the project? And that's happening in places like Richfield and other, inner ring suburbs where, they're a little bit further down the road in terms of diversifying their housing. But that's really the hard conversations that I think need to happen is, do we want to be more proactive? Do we want to, set aside more of our resources from a city perspective to help advance life cycle housing? Because we all recognize that it's a need. The data's there. I think anecdotally, I have kids that, would love to move back into this community. It's hard, to find a market. Just to look at market rate rentals is difficult unless you're already into your second or third job and have a pretty good income. So we know there's a need, and I think the cities just have to weigh out, are we going to be just reactive and deal with developers that come to us, or are we going to turn the corner and try to be promoting this and finding properties and developers to make it happen?
Before we go on, can I just ask, is there anything particular that would draw a builder to Scott County, given some of the things that you have outlined, some of the challenges? Like, are we competitive? Like, if all 5 metro suburb counties are kind of in the same spot, is there anything that would draw a developer here more than somewhere else?
There's no easy answer to that. I would love to say there was. I think overall Scott County's been great. That's why we keep coming here. I think transit is one area that I think over time is going to continue to restrict the communities. Shakopee really is the only one that has any decent transportation link to the rest of the metro. Because even if you have a community, to have a good community, you don't want, everybody's probably not going to work here. You want half of your households probably going to leave Scott County, or at least a major portion of them, and you need a way to do that. And I think that's one of the things that we see in a lot of your Hennepin County ones. Carver's probably behind, realistically, even Scott in that way. But I think the cities are great to work with. The land price is commensurate to, I think, what's going on here. I think, at least from multifamily, the cities have gradually become more of the zoning part. And I think that's really, from a developer perspective, it's what cities do you know you can work with, what cities are, going to give you a straight answer. Because if I come to the city with a project and we say, we want to do this, and they say, nope, I'd rather have that answer than say, well, maybe, and then you spend $100,000 trying to get it approved, and then the answer is no. So I think there's a lot of it is making sure that they understand what their goals are. And then when you come to a city and a county, and I think this county, because of the thing that's been done with scale and with the live, learn, earn, and the direction and the things that you're doing, you're ahead of a lot of the counties, I think, that are your maturity level in the county versus except maybe Dakota. I think Dakota probably is a little ahead or fairly even with you, and they've been active in that for a little bit longer. And I think you're starting to see that, whereas a Carver and Anoka, they're farther behind, I think, in that process. And you, Scott County, is starting to get closer to what Hennepin and Ramsey have done because they've just been a more mature county.
And I think we've heard that from a number of developers, and to Jake's earlier question around what our role of government is, I think we can help push some of that along as far as serving the vulnerable adults in our community, because when we're working with a developer and they're looking to get a tax credit property, for example, we're small enough and we're nimble enough that they know who they need to call, or at least we can find them fairly readily. They have to come and present to one of our local housing coalition groups to get a sign off on the project, and in that conversation we've been able to, I think, make some gains in ensuring that there are some specific units called out for people with disabilities and who are experiencing long-term homeless, more than has been typical in the past. So that's just been helpful for us from a Health and Human Services standpoint to ensure that we're representing those vulnerable citizens in new units being built.
I have a different question having to do with housing stock, and that is, you know, your traditional homes and are expensive. We know townhomes have their legal battles generally on the end that seems to have people shy away from that. But what are some of the conversations, maybe more at the city level, Brian, having to do with other non-traditional types of homes, such as your granny flats and your tiny homes and maybe some other type of home structure where maybe a big piece of property can provide independent living within independent units in a little bit different fashion? Can you talk to the group a little bit about if those conversations have been held at least your city, and or Mike, maybe at the development standpoint as to the feasibility of changing our housing stock and the look of a community?
We've had some dialogue about that. The challenge we run into is we'll have folks that come in and they have a traditional single-family home in a traditional neighborhood, and they'll say, we'd like to add on a separate unit to allow our in-laws to be able to move in. And, you know, the difficulty with that is not so much that use, because that would be great to accommodate, but the challenge is when they're gone, then what happens to that unit? Because in effect, you've now created a duplex in a single-family area, and, you know, at least historically, I think folks are protective of, hey, we moved to this neighborhood because it was single-family. So we've not made a lot of progress in that. I think a lot of cities struggle with that because, you know, while the granny flat approach is good for the interim, what happens long-term? And if it becomes a duplex and they're renting it out to somebody else, then you open up a whole other host of issues. So, so I think it's certainly something we need to continue to discuss, especially with our aging communities. I think it's going to be more of a need, but right now, at least, how you manage that is a little challenging.
I think that, you know, the issue we brought up is the future is probably the biggest thing. I think everything that we do and when we're working on anything that's considered a workforce or affordable, I think the concern isn't as much what happens to build it today, it's great. It's what's that 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road that the cities are having to deal with, and how do they regulate and keep those issues going forward. The one thing we're seeing, and we're seeing it more and more, is reduced lot sizes. And I think that's probably the one that a suburban community, or if like Scott County's overall, struggles with. I know that there's a project being proposed by a friend of ours that's 22-foot wide homes, and all alley fed, single family, detached, and they're gonna meet a price point, I think close to 300, or maybe a little less. So it's something you're not seeing, but it's something that's, you know, you're seeing Denver's doing it. It's actually, the product is coming from Stapleton, which when they redid the Denver airport in Stapleton, they really expanded out a lot of the concepts to try and figure out live, work, you know, smaller lots, vertical stuff. How do you make more homes fit in lots and still have them function well and be something the cities are proud of long term? And I think that's one that's going to evolve, is just continuing to shrink that lot size. We're not getting the 1 acre lots anymore. I mean, it just, unless you're willing to pay through the nose. And that's something that we, as almost everyone sitting in this room, isn't quite ready to accept yet. But our kids and our grandkids aren't seeing that, and they're not wanting to spend $600,000 on a home to get that extra half or 3/4 an acre. They're okay spending a chunk less than that and getting to know their neighbors more and being in a semi-multifamily, single-family situation, is probably the way to describe it, so.
I feel like I'd like to just ask one question on the very last slide before we move on to audience questions, just because this is a program that the county provides some financial resource to. This is about specific to the Families Moving Forward program. And I'm wondering, Danielle or Dan or someone, if you could speak to just some of the changes in that program that maybe like skews these numbers a little bit.
Well, I believe Beacon is here today and is prepared to make a statement about this, but I think this has just been a result of the overall barriers that we're seeing across the community. Again, Families Moving Forward is serving families who are experiencing homelessness, so they likely have some barriers in place, some income barriers, potentially some barriers in getting them into available units, and they just have not had that flexibility of being able to access open units across the community. So I think this is a reflection of that overall.
One of the things here, I just have the homeless data broken down all sorts of ways, but one of the things is, looking at January 2017, we had 36 homeless households with 36 children among those households. Currently, with the last one I did here in January, we had 38 households, but we had 68 children in those households. And so, and Beacon may speak to this a little bit better than I can, but it seems to me, looking at the data, is that the single parent with one child, single parent with two parents, one child, the smaller households are moving through the system because they're utilizing 2 bedrooms, and we have lots of 2 bedrooms in Scott County. It's those households that need the 3 bedrooms or the 4 bedrooms end up going into shelter, and then they're staying there for a long time because, one, they need a much larger voucher if they need a permanent supportive help, or if they need that short-term help, the issue is they just can't locate a unit. I mean, there's been period of times where we've worked with households who need a 3 or 4 bedroom, and they've had a voucher that can fully pay that amount, but there's 3-4 months go by and not a single 3 or 4 bedroom becomes available for rent during that entire period. So that's the challenge it's the bigger families that are getting kind of bottlenecked there because there's not units to move them into. And with that, I would turn it over to Beacon if they have.
You know what, can you wait just a second
sorry.
for that?
Yep.
Nope, that's okay. Can I just ask though, as we were getting ready for this, it was my understanding that there was a change in location that may have impacted the data from Scott to Carver or Carver to Scott. Is there?
So their day programming location changed. So Families Moving Forward operates on a host church model, which is helpful because it engages our faith-based communities. But it's a shared program with Scott County and Carver County, where a church congregation would host these families for, I think it's 2 weeks is the typical period of time, and then it would move to another congregation. So I think the day programming spot has changed over to Carver County, which has changed sort of the staff's home base has been over there, which I think if you're located in a community that could have a shift. But some of our families have expressed just some challenges in being able to accommodate that host family model, because although we are engaging a number of congregations, which is excellent, it's been hard on some of those kids who are having to move from one place to another, as well as it's difficult to serve people who have those higher needs, like people who are coming from domestic violence situations or people who are experiencing mental illness, have another disability, those types of things.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, panel, do you have other questions, or should we, no? Okay. Okay, could we, Mary? Hi. Mary Keene has our microphone, so if you are an audience participant and you'd like to ask a question, just indicate that to her and she'll meet you with the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Sakina. I'm the director over Families Moving Forward, and I just wanted to kind of address some of the questions that you guys had. in regards to that. So Danielle and Dan did a very good job in addressing how Families Moving Forward works. So just a quick overview of who we are is we only can serve 4 families at one time. And so that, again, is the need of families coming to us is high. We received 48 calls last year. We only could take in 11 families because we were full. So those resources are not available even for us to even service the families. And as Dan has mentioned, is that we have a really great outcome. As you can see, is 82% of our families since we opened in 2014. However, because we can't move them out because their families are getting longer, they're getting bigger, and so they're staying with us a little bit longer. We went from 68 of getting the families out, 68 days, to now 108 days. So I just want to kind of address that a little bit, is the impact that she mentioned earlier. Is what is that impact? What is the impact of overall is the families are staying in our program a little bit longer.
I work for Beacon as well. My name is Kevin Walker. I'm Director of New Projects. We've also very much, I just want to express the appreciation for the leadership and work of the folks assembled here to really focus on housing issues in the way that they have been. I think gives us a lot of hope for future efforts and ways to help address some of the issues that have been talked about. So, as you heard a moment ago from Sakina, we're seeing expansion of unmet needs for affordable housing locally through the operations of our shelter program here. We're seeing it with the growth in homelessness, that Minnesota Housing Partnership summarized in their write-up of the Wilder study, so that it's now close to 40% growth over a few-year period. We know from countless best practices from around the country that deeply affordable housing with services has the best chance to break the cycle of homelessness and to position individuals and families that experience homelessness for stability and for success, living, learning, and earning in their communities. And in addition to our active and successful shelter program here, we're one of several major nonprofit developers active in the Twin Cities. Some people think of Beacon just in terms of our shelter program. We're also one of the major nonprofit developers here in the Twin Cities with about 600 units across 17 properties throughout the Twin Cities. And as such, we can bring tax credits and housing infrastructure bonds from the state to new projects to be developed here, and put together with local matching dollars, state or federal rental assistance and service dollars, public and private. We expect that we could deliver 80 to 100% of the units that the 2010 Heading Home Scott Carver plan called for in Scott County. In short, we're planning to try to make a 40 to 50 unit family supportive housing project possible, and our target and our goal is to try to submit funding applications this next year. We certainly have our work cut out for us to, again, find and identify resources for service funding, service partners to help provide the kind of support that families need to be successful. We have several of our congregational leaders here as well today, and I expect we'll be in touch with additional feedback and ultimately support as we try to move these plans forward. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Barbara Brooks. I actually live in Waconia, but I am a volunteer leader with Beacon. I don't have a question, but I do have a challenge. Governor Walz came to the Beacon convening meeting and spoke as the state budget as being a moral document. And that is something that I have heard in church before, but never before from a government leader. Scott and Carver County seem to vie for the position of being the richest county in the state. And so I would offer a challenge to you to look at your county and your city and your state budget also as a moral document. And as we come from a faith perspective where we believe we are our brother's keepers, please keep that in mind. Thank you.
Hi. So I have kind of a personal situation where my mom was living in assisted living and she fell and ended up needing to have brain surgery, and so therefore could not go back to her assisted living facility unless she had 24-hour care. And so we were in urgent need of finding her memory care because she has dementia. And I called every available place in Scott County and some outside of Scott County, and was eventually able to find one place that had an opening. And thank goodness she's able to pay on her own, because if she needed assistance, there would be nowhere for her to go. So I find it interesting that you mentioned that seniors are not wanting to move out of their homes, but I think there's a dire need for situations where they don't have the choice and they need to move out of their homes and they need to have 24-hour care. So that's just my comment.
So thanks for putting all this data together. You've looked at a lot of different models, thought of a lot of great things. Could each of the panel members give us your 2 or 3 best ideas if you didn't have to worry about rules or the existing political climate or all of the normal constraints, and you really just kind of went for what do you really like in terms of things you've seen, ideas you've thought about, so we could break through some of these issues?
So I can start us out. I think from a health and human services standpoint, I think we really see every day those stories about seniors who are looking for options, people with mental illness. So I think it would be great if we had an unlimited checkbook to be able to provide supportive housing for some of our vulnerable populations. So not only those units where they have a place to live, but also the supportive services that help build people to be successful. I think the other thing that I would like to see us keep going, which I think we've done really well, is with the support of our board and with the support of Scale, is having opportunities to host the conversation and to engage our community. Because I think when we talked for almost 3 years with our housing work group, the common thread that we saw through everything was either engagement or education, and whether that was having conversations with our cities or with our community members, that was the common thread that kept coming up over and over again, was that engagement, helping people communicate the data and that need. So I would like to see us continue that work.
I don't think we have long enough for me to answer that question, but I think the reality is, even if you had all the resources, even if everything else was there to move forward, the education and the understanding and the NIMBYism is probably the biggest single factor right now preventing good affordable housing from being built in any metropolitan area. And I think it's truly an education and knowledge base, the fact that as you get to learn that everybody is really the same. And yeah, there's projects where if someone goes and spends $1 million on a house, they may want their community to be that way. But from an overall perspective, that doesn't mean that a block down the street, I can't have a project that has 30% AMI or 60% AMI, or that has income restrictions, and all of a sudden that's going to ruin my community. I think that the dollars and cents is only half of the issue. The real issue is understanding the need and the people that live in workforce housing and in service-related housing that need to be there, and that's the biggest issue to get over as much as the money.
I would concur with that. I've been encouraged by the fact that over the last several years I've met with multiple developers that are looking to do projects of this sort. Before it was pretty much Ron Clark and his group, and that was it. And so we're seeing more activity as far as folks that are understand the process of getting these kind of projects done and are approaching cities. So I guess my desire, at least for the city of Savage, is that we work actively with the folks that are willing to stick their neck out and try to get a project done, get behind those kind of projects, support them from an approval process standpoint and from a financing standpoint to the extent that we can, and try to make headway, because I think that's it. I think the partnership between our cities, county, and the developers is real critical, and we can't just step back and just say, let's let the market do it, because it won't happen that way. It can't.
I would say, much to Danielle's first point, just an affordable unit or housing option for everybody who lives in your community. We need, and then on top of that, we need an adequate safety net so they can maintain their stable housing, or if they happen to lose their stable housing so they can get rehoused quickly. And then that there aren't a lot of barriers that come with that housing, so that we have housing that will allow folks to have a criminal history and to have mental health history and to have some of the barriers that make it really difficult for us to house our the folks that we work with on a daily basis. If those barriers could all go away, we would be leaps and bounds ahead of where we are right now.
Yeah, so just from my own experience too, I think for me, I agree with everything that's already been said, and for me, it's just two things. It's the density, and if you increase the density or allow a higher density on the multifamily housing, that lowers the cost. They're not buying an extra acre and a half of land and then not developing it to meet the density standards. And then the transportation is that, I love the idea of land trusts. I 100% support that. I think that now Scott County's in a place where we have an opportunity to utilize that, especially along the southern end of the county, where now is the time where the incomes would make those homes and stuff affordable, and then being able to preserve that so that in 10, 15 years, those homes continue to be affordable, and again, that we can move those higher end of the renters into housing and then into their second or third homes after that. But one of the big barriers that a lot of our households have in utilizing our vouchers, like in the rental market, is they don't want to go to a Belle Plaine or a New Prague or an Elko New Market because they can't get back to where the services are and the jobs are in a large part on the north end of the county. So just being able to get people back and forth. And then, with the density, I live in a 1,000 square foot house in Minneapolis on a 16th of a lot, and for a young family that works great. But as Mike's talking with the cost of building the home that I have now is probably $60,000-$70,000 more than what I paid for my house when I bought it.
Yeah, I agree totally with everything everyone said, and I think if we're talking about life cycle housing, we do need to have housing for, the people that do your hair, people that watch your children, all the way up the scale. And again, that's a lot of education and outreach and understanding and acceptance of that. I know with the Community Land Trust, education to those homeowners is a vital piece of that, and at the CDA we do have home ownership counseling and education, so that makes them far more successful than a lot of times an ordinary homeowner. But there also has to be the understanding of people that they're not getting subsidies because they don't want to work or do what everyone else is doing. And again, that's the just understanding the broader scope of what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
So I have a question from the audience here. Do we have any concerns with our apartment buildings about their tax credits ending and conversion to market rate facing us here over the next couple of years? I've read about that in other communities, actually the one I grew up in, it was a real big issue. Are there things we're looking at with that, or how many units is that could potentially create a problem for us in our community?
I think we've seen that play out a little bit for some of our folks that we've provided homeless vouchers for. We've seen them sort of been priced out of their units where those affordable options will be purchased and then renovated and have the rents hike up. I think that's been a concern for us in the future as well. I don't know that we have any hard numbers about how many units that would be, or if we have a consistent plan that is throughout the county that helps address and prevent that from happening. So that would be an opportunity I think we could see in Scott County.
From a tangible perspective on the tax credit program, there's 4% program and a 9% program, just a quick blush. The 4% program is less tax credits but also a less time frame. So a lot of the ones you see converting out were done under that program, which was only a 15-year compliance plan. Going forward, and I think this let's say 2008, 2009, they converted it to a 30-year program. So all the 9% programs, so like our Village Commons project that opened in 2012 and 13, we're locked in for 30 years as an affordability. At that ending point, there is a potential that that could convert to market rate. We've looked at a couple of things with some of the nonprofits and the CDAs that maybe there is a transition plan down the road that allows them to maybe have a right of first refusal or something that would work on that. We've actually talked about that with Dakota County. The other thing too is Minnesota Housing in the newest RFP is actually looking at a 40-year statute, a 40-year compliance period instead of 30. So you start to push those timeframes out, and I think a lot of what you've seen have been the ones that were on the 15-year before they extended it out. At the 30-year timeframe, even if it's converted to market, it's going to have to put a substantial amount of dollars into it. And what we're seeing in a lot of cases is they go back and get additional credits at that point to do a complete remodel, and the additional credits help permanently keep that affordable then for another 30 or 40 years. But it does have the potential of being issues in a lot of the cities where tax credit stuff was done 15, 20, and 30 years ago right now.
And that happened with one of our properties that we frequently work with, is the rents for a 2-bedroom were around $830, and now 2.5 years later, they're around like $970. And so for those with subsidies, some of that can get absorbed by the subsidies, but for those households who were just self-paying and were kind of in those income brackets that, $50,000 or whatever, they're getting priced out because they're essentially having to come up with an extra $1,200 to $1,500 a year for their rent that they just don't have.
Madam Chair, I guess I will turn it over to you if there are questions that the commissioners would like to ask. I'm aware that we're banging up against our timeline as well, so.
Wonderful, wonderful, thank you. Colleagues, any questions? Let's start with you, Commissioner Ulrich.
Okay, it's going to be a comment and a little bit of editorial and maybe a question.
Surprise you?
There was a big box employer that came into our community, warehouse type employer, and we were told by our new executive director, that they will say that they don't provide transit. They won't help with transit to get employees to their location. But I've just come from another area of the country, and they do help with transit, and they will contribute money to transit. And we will be able to get money from them to help be a partner in transit, and that's ended up playing out to be true. Okay, so my question is this, to Mike probably. Mike, when you do an affordable project, affordable housing project, you're seeking subsidies, from the CDA, from the state, or whatever, different programs where you can undergird the cost of a unit so you can make it work. My question is, or my belief is, that the ability to government to keep giving these grants and subsidies is going down. It's going to keep going down. CDA gets several of them, and they're questioning amongst themselves, can we keep doing this? Can we keep giving these subsidies to make these projects go? Well, now, just like in transit, my question is, why don't we get business to become a partner? Why don't we go to some of these big box or big employers and say, look, you can contribute X to this project, and we'll guarantee you X number of units based on how much you contribute. Take government out of it completely and do partnerships with business. I hope you'll explore that. And I wonder if there's anywhere in the country where they that seems to me, if a big box employer needs 1,000 employees and they can't get them, they're struggling to get them, it would seem to me they're going to start being extra creative in how to fill those jobs.
I think the biggest issue becomes the regulations around housing today, and the fact that even if that big box retailer supports a project, they have no ability to make sure that their employees are the ones living there. And I think it's not like the old Kohler, Wisconsin. Kohler built a town. Everybody lived there. That model was in place for years and years and every state has multiple towns like that. We're seeing that in outreach. When you're going to Thief River Falls or some of the areas that are outstate and have major employers, we are seeing some financial involvement, whether it's buying land and donating, or whether it's doing things like that. We are seeing more business involvement, not as much in the metro, the 7-county metro area yet. But I think that is something that, I think is a combination. I don't think either one can push it all to the other, but I think as a government source, when we're doing TIF for a new building, that maybe some of that TIF should be working its way back to housing at the same time, beyond just the business development. Because that building and business is probably there for 20 years and then it's off in somewhere else. If you look at your average industrial park, that housing unit is there for the next 100 years. And I think those are some of the returns that you look at. But
At one
a good point.
There was a presentation that Rochester, Minnesota had provided, and they have, I think, a model that they've built in. And I don't know if it's the city model or if the county participates in. It sounds like it's a collaborative, but every new development, they have a certain percentage of that development cost that has to go into developing affordable housing options. So could be another opportunity to explore.
And Richfield's doing an inclusive zoning. They're just in the process of doing something right now where they want 9% affordable in any new project that's being built, or a compensating fund put into that. And again, there's a fine line at that point as to now what have you done to everybody else's price of their home, because now that price is going up 10 to 12%, if the costs are going up 9%. But in the overall balance of the city, it does give you a better basis for that per program. And I think Richfield, at least Bloomington, is doing it right now. Bloomington's new plan is, I think, moving in a good direction. There's going to be pluses and minuses, and it's going to really play out over the next 10 years to see how they apply it. But they're doing some of that where it's having the density bonuses and making affordability on a higher end project be subsidy for a lower end.
Just one, this is really editorial comment, but if a business is not partnering or not encouraged or forced to partner, if they're paying a certain lower salary, then government becomes the subsidy. It just is like automatic. I mean, if people are getting not a livable wage, well, then they come to us and say, I need help. Well, business needs to play a stronger role in that, and not always government subsidizing.
Commissioner Beard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. There was some talk about some emergency housing, and as I listened to this whole discussion, it's large, it's a little confusing, because I'm hearing just talk about general housing stock and homelessness from people who used to take it upon themselves as their personal responsibility to acquire some sort of living arrangement for their families. But beyond that, there seems to be a subset of truly urgent emergency, something happened, a fire, a divorce, an illness, and they find themselves homeless, particularly their kids. And this is a question for somebody who may know, just because I've lost track of it. But I had a friend that used to manage an emergency shelter over by Shepherd of the Lake that had like 8 or 10 overnight or emergency short-term things for kids who were thrown out, left, lost a parent, something happened. Is that still going on, or what happened to that program? Does anybody recall what that's at?
I think you're talking about the link.
Yeah, so it's a different organization that's operating it now. It still exists. And they're it's somewhat focused on youth who've experienced trafficking.
Okay.
Yep. But I mean, it's still a resource that's out there. It's still around the same size. But it has, I mean, if someone was a youth, especially like under 18 or just over 18, is experiencing homelessness, they would work with them. Also in Carver County, there's Launch Ministry, who kind of serves the 18 to 24-year-old range, and they work with youth who are experiencing kind of those immediate needs and stuff as well. So it does in a slightly different form.
Can I just clarify? And Dan's correct, but it's called the link at this point, and that is very specific to sexually exploited youth. And we certainly have had youth there, but it is not a shelter in the same way that you're thinking of. Where I shouldn't say just homeless youth, but where homeless youth could just go. It is really specific to sexually exploited youth. It's really a regional model at this point, serving a very specific population.
Thank you.
Commissioner Ulrich.
Now, this is going to be a commercial, okay? At 9:43, I got an email. It's from the CAP agency. It's about it was to the FISH Partner Network. And it said, older gentleman has health issues. He's been sleeping outside. They got him a place to live, but he basically needs everything inside. You know, bed, couch, chairs, everything. 8 minutes later, somebody said, I got a couch and a love seat. You know, they're starting to respond. So if you're not part of the FISH Partner Network, I encourage you to consider becoming part of it. This is how we meet needs in our community. People post needs, the community meets needs, and it's really quick, 8 minutes, the need is starting to already be met. That's my commercial.
Thank you for that. Commissioner Beard, did you have any other comments?
I did, yeah. I was happy to make time for the commercial break. Especially that one, since FISH is pretty near and dear to our hearts philosophically and morally. You know, FISH does everything out of voluntary association, which I think, as long as we're speaking about religion and Christianity, that really is the command on each one of our lives, is that we step up individually. For us as politicians to step up, you got to remember that we have people with guns that compel behavior and compliance. That's not really voluntary association. I would question just how much love is being spread around when we take your taxes, and if you don't comply, we send the sheriff to your house, and he will take your house. It's just the way the system works. So know that that's a philosophical point of dissension, intention, and a constant debate among us with election certificates, because we hear about the need here, and it touches our hearts, and it touches our souls outside of this place, because we have a relationship with the Creator, and we do feel like we need to take care of our friends and our neighbors. That's a very important part of what we do. But how we accomplish that is where the debate is. Because if I just raise the taxes of the little old lady on Fifth Avenue and give some more money to Danielle, that's not compassion on my part. That's politics. That earns me votes from somebody, I guess. Maybe not from the little old lady who I took more money from. But that's just kind of my editorial comment. But I want to compliment Jake on asking the question to all of us, because it's one that we listen to here. What is the role of government in all of this? It's one we discuss and debate constantly, and we think about it as we weigh everything we do as government. What is our common core of beliefs? Do we have to run the courthouse? Yeah, we do. Do we have to help make sure that people drive on the right side of the road and stop on red? Yeah, those are common things that we all agree to. But when it comes to taking care of core human needs like food and shelter, some of us remember the days when that was a human personal responsibility. It was my responsibility to feed my kids, not bring them down here and ask you guys to feed them. It was my responsibility to build a house for my family, not yours. So that's a tension that some of us feel in our very souls as we listen to this discussion. Now, I'm also on the board of the Benedictine Health System, and at 2:30 this afternoon, we're going to break ground on the Benedictine Living Center on the west end of Shakopee. That'll be eventually almost 300 units, which will encompass independent living, assisted living, and memory care. And because of its nonprofit Christian basis, yes, we have to have a surplus at the end of the month, because we have to be able to continue to build these things. And you know, people who lend us money like to know that you have a surplus so you can make the mortgage payment. But we also build our business model to take in those who can't actually pay their own freight. And I've seen the numbers, and some of them are heart-wrenching. People whose Social Security check is $900 a month, and it costs us $3,000 a month to take care of them. How do you make that work? And that's a nonprofit with a heart for ministry. And we're constantly in this dynamic. So please don't think that because we're not giving you an unlimited budget, we don't care and we don't feel the moral imperative to try to find something to do. But back to Jake's comment, what is government's role in this whole thing? And I'm going to point to a comment at the bottom of page 14 that kind of alarms me a little bit. And I'm going to suggest a better way to look at it as we contemplate what's our role. The last, why does this matter? It says, to evaluate if Scott County is adding units at a pace to keep up with demand. The unspoken inference there is somehow it's our fault if units aren't added, or it's our responsibility. And I got to tell you, I think if you're going to ask for Scott County to be responsible for adding those units, you're asking for a peck of trouble.
Commissioner, I think that's Scott County at large, so it's.
Yep.
The geography.
It's the
I'm not
geography.
done. The better way to say that is our concern should be if units are being added in Scott County, if units are being, that implies that there are others who are actually helping with this. It's not just us, the five of us, and all the good people who work for us. But it's you. It's also, I would encourage you to look at this in such a way that whatever we do, we don't dampen that human initiative to make ourselves better, to take care of our families. Whatever we do, don't dampen that. Don't impinge on that. Encourage people to want to take control of their own destinies. And I know you're probably in your heart of hearts, you're thinking, what's he talking about? But I just want you to know when I see something like that, my first automatic reaction is, whoa, this is almost implying that Scott County is responsible for looking out for this. And I would tell you, our job is to set the table as county officials so that your kids and my kids can build and buy their own place, and that whenever I'm 85 and need a place to live, I've set the table so that people like the Benedictine Health System will have a place for me to live when my memory's completely shot and I need somebody to help me eat my tomato soup or something like that. So that's out there. And one other thing I encourage you to think about, again, I'm thinking back to my own perspective on history and my own upbringing in the mountains of Pennsylvania, and that's manufactured housing. We don't even see this talked about here. I'm talking about mobile home parks. That used to be a way people started on their own, because the ability to qualify for a loan on a double wide is way different than the ability to qualify for a loan on a half acre of land and a 2,000 foot rambler. And that's the way a lot of us started our lives. We built our equity on our own dime in a way where somebody else owned the land, we owned the unit, and if we needed to move it, we could, and if we didn't, we sold it to the next kids coming along once we bought our own dirt and built our own house. I guess I have no questions. I just want you to know, as I heard the discussion, certain things kind of hit my heart a certain way, and I just wanted you to hear how I think about these things anyhow, as I represent about 37,000 people that I take money from every day, so we can have snow plows and we can have parks and we can have crisis housing intervention where it's needed to be had. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Beard. Comments or questions?
Boy, I'm going to follow that guy. I do tend to err on the side of personal responsibility and accountability, and also stuff does happen. And this is an incredibly complex issue, but it's also not a new problem. Can we all agree with that? Housing is not a new problem. I don't think I'm on an island on that. And it just feels to me, Mike and I, we probably had these discussions after some of our Wednesday meetings, but that it's not a new problem, but we're not bringing anything new to the table. It's sort of the same old solutions to the same old problems, and maybe some of them work, but it just feels like we're at a day and age where we need to be looking at new things. Maybe it's these references, you referenced in Stapleton or whatever. Maybe it's going back, sometimes when the next new thing is the first old thing, that's not always a bad solution. Whether it's a double wide or whatever it happens to be. But entertaining the conversation of new solutions to old problems that can maybe try to move the needle. That's what I'm always at, like, what's transforming about this? Are people, are they moving down the line, so to speak, or are we just simply warehousing? Like, I don't want to be in the warehousing of people business. I really don't. For a time, maybe. I mean, I think, being a backstop, absolutely. To get people on their feet, I'm all in. Personally, I'm all in. That's how I live my life. So I'm not going to do anything differently here. But we have to think, use the old cliche, right? Outside the box. figure out new solutions to some of these problems. I know some of them are legislative. The one that drives me nuts is, you know, Mike's got to build certain square footage, and he's got to make sure his counter space is so many square inches, because to meet some housing parameter, I'm just like, wow, we could have had, I don't know, 10 more units in the Pike Lake Marsh. I don't know what the need is huge. The need is huge, and it just seems like it's like a drop into the ocean. Until we get serious about it and make some of these legislative changes that are oftentimes outside our control, but some of the things are. We're just kicking the can down the road, and another 10 years, we're gonna have a meeting like this, probably next year. We're gonna have a meeting like this, we're gonna be all emotional, and the need is huge, and we gotta do this, but nothing changes. Nothing changes. No one's transformed. We just kick the can down the road. I don't wanna do that. I don't know what the solution is. I always like to ask the question, if I put one silver bullet on here, you know, what would that be? You know, Lloyd tried to get at it. I realize you're not gonna shoot one shot here, but until we're ready to really take this head on, I think we just exchange pleasantries and stories and pull on some heartstrings, and something maybe gets built and a very small percentage of the need gets taken care of. I realize this is a societal issue, and there's a lot of things that go into trying to transform that so that we do care for one another. I'm kind of, am I beyond my 5 minutes now too?
You're getting there.
I'm getting there. I'm getting my timers. She's grabbing the gavel up here. So that's just, I'm just putting that out there, that's kind of my convictions, is personal responsibility. Hey, I'm here to help. I'm willing to help people out. But we can't keep digging in pockets and not getting anywhere with transformation in people's lives. That's just my, kind of where I fall out on all of this. I'm willing to do whatever I can do, and I hope that we're all, as human beings, willing to do that. That, to me, is where the solution lies, not with people with gavels or sit behind a big desk. We can be part of the solution, but not the solution. I think that's it.
Thank you for those comments. Commissioner Wolf.
I would just say, I heard a lot of NIMBYism. I don't know who said it. Yeah. I deal with a lot, and I think maybe you do too a little bit in our areas, but there's a lot of that, but there's also, and I'm being very short here, the keeping up with the Joneses. And, you know, a lot of people, you know, they'll, instead of spending money on houses, they'll have a $45,000 truck sitting out in their yard, and it's like, okay. Anyway, that's all I'll say.
All right, thank you.
Sorry, one last thing. That's a big one. The one last thing I did want to mention is I think we did sit in this room a year ago, and we had a housing consortium talking about housing. One question I had is, hey, if there was a faith-based home that had an open bed, I didn't mention what faith, I just said faith, would that be a stumbling block? And I think someone on CAP was sitting down at the end and shaking their head, yeah, I think that would be. And I think one of our own kind of thought maybe it would be too, sitting in the audience. And I think there's a gentleman in the back that I see at different fish meetings that does some of that type of scenario where you have homes, faith-based, with beds that could have heads in them. Is that a hindrance? We're kind of the collection point of all the need, and man, we get all these stories and this and that, and we don't have places to put them, but there's places out there that we could at least refer them to, but if faith is the stumbling block, is that still the case? And
I
with
don't
that,
think, sorry.
Go ahead, Danielle, I'd like you to address that.
Yeah, I don't think it's a stumbling block at all. I think we have needs across the board for different populations that need housing options. I think faith-based works for a lot of people. It doesn't work for some. So the
Amen.
important thing for us to consider is to make sure we have a variety of options available. The other piece to it is how do we sustain it long-term with funding? And so some of the faith-based organizations and their programming is harder to fund with state and federal dollars because they don't check some of those boxes. But I think we're open to all options across the community.
so we've moved in a year. That's good news.
Definitely. All right, I would like to wrap this segment up. I do have a couple of comments. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's here. I am going to be a little more optimistic than my colleagues here. We are making progress. For somebody who's lived here for 48 years now, we are making progress on variety of housing stock and how we've evolved in helping people help themselves. I think that's evident by how full this room is today, by all the faith-based partners who are here today, the business partners around this table. I would bet, decades ago, even at a county government meeting, we did not see this kind of engagement or involvement. That may have been government's fault, it may have been community, whatever. I think we've made huge progress in those things. So I really thank those folks who are here today. We are making progress. I was really glad to hear the information about families moving forward, because as we've all talked about, we have limited resources, and that is one place this board has said we want to help families move forward out of homelessness. So to see those numbers, to know that we are at capacity and serving as many families as we can is important. If it takes a little longer, it takes a little longer, but that's important. I think Commissioner Beer's comment about being creative is a reminder we need to have every day. It sounds like, and it seems like, from at least a government role perspective, one of our biggest needs is that emergency shelter. Yet it's not one emergency shelter to serve people who are disabled, people who are seniors, people fleeing from domestic violence. That doesn't work. We don't have the population density here to have 5 kinds of emergency shelters. So we need to really look, and I think we can learn from our neighbors about what emergency shelter success means. It's not necessarily a building where you can go put your head in a bed. It's more like families moving forward. It's more like very creative options for folks fleeing domestic violence. And so I'm hopeful, especially because of all the non-government employees and community members in this room who care and who are working together. I think we've expressed very well the role of county government here is to engage, to assist private developers get those tax credits from federal and state by helping find people who can go into those units for people with disabilities and seniors. It's to care for our most vulnerable. That's really what at least this board has expressed. It's we don't want to take anything away from private developers. We want to let you do your job and build that variety of housing stock. So thank you for everybody's engagement. Stay tuned, talk to each other about what's going on in your arenas, and know that your input and your engagement in this issue is really appreciated.